Hey everybody, welcome to video 70. Today's going to be a pretty short lecture. For this lecture, we're going to be looking at disorders of the female reproductive system. So there are many different disorders that can occur just because of all the changes that the female body is going to go through, starting from development through puberty, through pregnancy, everywhere in between. Just like in males, we have the same definitions of infertility and sterility, where infertility is going to be a drastic decrease in the ability to reproduce, while sterility is a complete inability to reproduce. So the first one, and maybe the most common one, is menstrual cramps. These are going to be caused by an overproduction of a hormone, or a hormone group known as prostaglandins. So prostaglandins, when they are produced in high quantities, it's going to cause muscle spasms within uterine muscles. Remember, the uterus is pretty much entirely made of muscle. There's not a whole lot of other connective tissue and things like that in there. But the spasms of the muscular tissue are going to constrict blood and oxygen delivery. It's going to constrict those blood vessels and decrease the amount of oxygen that those muscles are getting. And as a result, that's going to cause a lot of pain because you basically have oxygen-starved muscles of the uterus. So typically, ibuprofen or naproxen sodium is going to be used to treat these menstrual cramps by decreasing the amount of prostaglandins that are being produced. It's a very common disorder. About 75 to 80% of women will have menstrual cramps at some point in their life, so very, very common. Another one, a little more serious, is secondary amenorrhea. This is going to be when those menstrual periods are going to slow to 3 or fewer in a year. So this is one menstrual period every 4 months or longer, approximately. Some things associated with secondary amenorrhea: weight loss, pregnancy, and menopause. So you think pregnancy, obviously you're having fewer than 3 periods in a year. Menopause is also going to slow that down. Weight loss, where your body just can't handle shedding during menses and then rebuilding during the proliferative phase. Those can also be associated with secondary amenorrhea. The sports triad, one that's typically seen in high school and college age females. It's a group of 3 disorders associated with severe calorie deficit as well as overtraining. And so typically we see this in females that have a flawed body image, or they believe that the thinner they are, the more athletic they are going to be. And so you get these 3 things. You get severe weight loss, you get secondary amenorrhea, and you get osteoporosis. So that's why it's the triad is those 3, and we typically see it again in high school and college athletes. Dysfunctional uterine bleeding, abbreviated DUB, is going to be very irregular. Uterine bleeding, usually there's some sort of structural problem or some sort of hormonal problem that's going on that's causing these irregular bleeding patterns. But it is somewhat common. About 2 million women in the U.S. will have DUB. Another one, premenstrual syndrome, is just a collection of different things during the secretory phase. And that's going to lead to things like irritability, fatigue, nervousness, and depression. Causes of it are unknown, and it's going to affect different women differently, but usually it's some group of things like this. And then not a disorder, but something that is used to test for a disorder is a Papa-Nicolau test, or a Pap smear, as it's more commonly known. It's going to be done to test cervical cancer. And so what they do in a Pap smear is they're going to take a swab of those cells on the cervix. Remember that cervix, the narrow portion of the uterus. They're going to take a swab of those cells and observe them under a microscope to look and see if there's any cancerous tissue that can be noticed under a microscope. Some other things, an ectopic or ectopic pregnancy, I've heard it pronounced both ways, is when the blastocyst is not going to implant in the uterine wall. Instead, it's going to implant somewhere else. And that can be a bunch of different areas. Typically, something like the fallopian tube is possible. If it implants in the fallopian tube that can be fatal because obviously there's not enough space in the fallopian tube, and if you were to actually rupture that fallopian tube, that could be an issue for the mother. If that blastocyst ends up implanting on the mesentery of digestive organs, that baby would have to be delivered via C-section. It would be a very dangerous pregnancy to be able to carry it, since obviously that baby is not coming to term inside the uterus. A miscarriage, we're going to define a miscarriage as being the loss of the embryo or fetus before the 20th week. So that's during the first trimester or up to part of the second trimester. It's also known as a spontaneous abortion. Typically, we're going to see this due to some sort of structural defect in the offspring. Miscarriages are actually fairly common here in the United States. We'll go over the different trimesters of a pregnancy. But we see a lot of miscarriages during the first trimester. And so that's kind of a very scary time for a new mother, for a new father especially, where you don't typically tell a lot of people that you're pregnant, just because it is a non-zero chance that you will miscarry during the first trimester. But really, once you get into the second trimester, and especially beyond the 20th week, your chances of a miscarriage go significantly down. And so that's when people typically start to reveal to family and friends, to the world, that they are pregnant. And then a stillbirth is going to be the loss of that fetus after the 20th week. Very, very rare that you would see a stillbirth. Again, typically there's going to be some sort of structural defect that took place along the way, or as that baby was preparing for labor, something went wrong. Okay, so again, a very brief look at some of the disorders associated with the female reproductive system. Brief names, brief descriptions of these. So if you have any questions, or if you have any others that you've heard about before and want to talk about, let me know.